Hi, everybody. Today is Tuesday, January 21st, 2025, and our guest today is Håkan Bergmark from Sweden. He's a Swedish podcaster, and welcome, Håkan.
Thank you very much for having me, Nima.
My pleasure. Let's get started, Håkan, with what's going on in Europe.
Yeah.
How, in your opinion, what is the reaction of the European, I cannot say the European Union, European countries. You're from Sweden. How do the people feel about Donald Trump and his presidency?
Well, most people among the population are pretty shocked because they have been fed information that there was no way a person like Donald Trump could win this election a second time around. Mainstream media here is very biased. There was a poll uh, before the November election among Swedish people. They did a poll, and let me see if I can remember. It was about a 60% overweight for Kamala Harris, in the opinion in the Swedish population. So they're pretty shocked. And mainstream media here, they're really shocked because they were the ones feeding the information that Donald Trump is a fascist and a mass murderer, and everything's going to be very bad for the Europeans, given that he comes into office, which he did. So that's about it.
Do they really want to be more? When you talk about Europe and European countries, do you really think that they want some sort of independence from the United States, or they see themselves as being I don't know if we can call them partners, but the as a tool for the United States to fight against Russia and China?
Obviously, they do feel that they act like the little brother to the United States when it comes to the European Commission and the Parliament. Um, of course, there was a worry about Trump's promise that he actually did is to stop taxing the American workers and people. Instead, he wants, and he's going to do it, look at tariffs from imported goods into the United States. And that's been worrying. But I think that this might be a wake up call for many of the bureaucrats in Brussels, in the European Commission, most of all, to what's changing. And I think it's going to spread somehow a little bit this. I mean, look at what Trump did his first day. He made a lot of decisions. He signed a lot of executive orders, and most of them, of course, is around the United States itself. But it has something to do with the global market and things like that. We'll see. I mean, right now they're all in Davos in Switzerland, visiting Klaus Schwab's meeting, the World Economic Forum. The Swedish Prime Minister Ulf Kristersson actually sent a congratulation note via X to the inauguration ceremony in Washington last night, Swedish time. So we'll see if it means anything by that. Sweden's largest electronic manufacturers and telecom company, Ericsson, gave $500 million to President Trump's inauguration. Of course, Ericsson is a global company, and they have a lot of manufacturing. They have a lot of business dealings in the United States. So I guess they wanted to say, hey, look at here, we give you $500 million. Don't do anything to our business, being dependent on the United States as a company. So there'll be a lot of consequences.
Yeah, it's so amazing to see how is the situation in Sweden and Finland? Because we know these two countries recently joined NATO. Do they, when you look at this, the people in Sweden, and based on what you're what you see within the society, do you think that they really felt that would be a danger from Russia? That's why they have joined NATO. It is something beyond that. It's a force coming from the United States to capture, to bring Sweden into NATO. Many
Hmm.
people, when we talk about Finland and Sweden, these two countries which are close to Russia, closer to the Russian borders, and a lot of relationship and traditions, and we we saw that these people don't want any sort of conflict. We've seen during years and years that they don't want any sort of conflict with Russia. But right now, being part of NATO, it brings conflict to the countries, to Finland, to Sweden. And maybe NATO wants to put their missiles in Sweden or Finland. How
Hmm.
do you feel about that? Do you think that was necessary being part of NATO? What was the necessity of being part of NATO? Do you really feel that Russia going to march toward Sweden, Finland, as in right now in Germany, they're talking about they want to, by 2028, they want to march toward Germany. It's so important to know how do the people feel there.
Hmm. Well, personally, if it was going to be a necessity to join NATO, we should have done it in the 40s or the 50s or the 60s, when the Cold War was a little bit more uncertain, and it was the Soviet Union. Since about 1990, it's totally ridiculous for Sweden, particularly, to give up 200 years of military non-alliance and complete neutrality, even if we bended for Nazi Germany during World War II, but that was necessary to keep Sweden out of the conflict. And our neighbors to the west, Norway, was invaded by Germany, and also Denmark to our south. Finland, of course, experienced war in their country during World War II, so they have fresh memories of being invaded by Germany and by the Soviet Union. But since then, it's always been we have our own quite formidable defenses, as it was, although it's been neglected during the 90s, both in Finland and Sweden. To join NATO actually put us all of a sudden at risk. But worse than that, Nima, is that our defense minister went to Washington and offered what he called a defense security agreement, DCA, which states that we are letting up 17 of our Swedish military bases to American troops with no restriction on nuclear weapons on Swedish soil, nor the American soldiers that are already placed here, they are not under Swedish law. They're under American law. And this is, they basically, Sweden paid money to sell our country to the United States of America and thereby NATO. NATO is synonymous to me with the United States of America. So it's total lunacy. And also, it was done without a referendum, without asking people about it, no voting, no nothing. They just, all of a sudden, from saying never, we're going to join NATO, to the next day, we join NATO now. And that was after the government of Sweden and World Economic Forum's people in Finland, Sanna Marin, had been having a conversation. Well, we create a threat so we can do this, and by joining NATO, and it was, I mean, media here could have said, why didn't you let the people vote? But they didn't. We have a monopoly situation on the media in Finland and in Sweden, or oligarchy, whatever. There's two major news channels and the state channels, two major private and one state owned. So to me, I'm a naval officer, so I'm retired from that. But during the 70s and the early 80s, we actually had some incidents, international incidents in the Baltic Sea, which, you know, is our common sea here, with the Russian submarine, for example, coming up on the rocks in a secret military area of southern Sweden. We had a bunch of other incidents that I have knowledge about that the public never knew, how NATO and Soviet Union were patrolling with submarines and the other naval forces in the Baltic Sea. It's very, very close to a real conflict during those years. But after the Berlin Wall, after the dissolvement of the Warsaw Pact and the collapse of Soviet Union, there's been no risk at all. But now there is, since I mean, Finland, they have a land border to Russia for 1,400 kilometers, you know? So it's total ludicrousy.
Since you've mentioned the situation in Sweden, as you remember, we had a bombing, we had a sabotage, we had the sabotage of Nord Stream pipeline, which many people believe that the Swedish government, right after the incident, after the attack, went down and cleaned up everything in order to just help the United States. What is your take on the role of the Swedish government and the way that they were trying to manage the situation in the aftermath of Nord Stream pipeline, the sabotage of the Nord Stream pipeline?
Well, the greatest industrial sabotage in modern history, blowing up the Nord Stream. And we know from tracking marine traffic and all that, Sweden has pretty good underwater surveillance naval forces and salvage and rescue equipment. And I tracked the Belos, which is what the main ship is called, and they were there immediately on at least 20 occasions with underwater activities. And it's clear to me, although it's secret operations, it's clear to me that they were there on a cleanup operation. You're absolutely right. And it's in both the Danish and the Swedish economic zone in the Baltics, where the two explosions occurred. But there's one pipeline still intact, but it's not open because Germany didn't want to do it. And it's incredible also how the German government treated this, because they're the ones that are going to benefit from this pipeline. And Olaf Scholz, when Biden's in the White House stated that they would destroy the pipeline, he stood in the same room and smiled. Now look at what's going on in Germany. They have a total energy crisis coming up. Now, so far, the winter hasn't been that cold in the north part of Europe, but winter is not over. We have January now. We're coming up with the coldest month in Northern Europe is February. And it could snow all the way into May in these areas of Europe. So Germany's really in trouble. Sweden had nothing to lose, really, other than being very, very conformative with the will of the United States to cover it up. But anybody that's got a mind knows it was United States that did this with the help of Norwegians, because same week as this pipeline blew up, the Nord Stream, Norway and Conoco, the oil company, completed the pipeline from the Norwegian gas fields to the same place in northern Germany. How come?
And
Norway, as you know, has a formidable also underwater capacity, since most of their gas and oil fields are in the North Sea, which is deep, and it requires a lot of technical underwater capabilities just to keep it running. So
what's so amazing, Hakan, is that Finland and Sweden, especially Finland, these countries survived the Cold War between the Soviets and the West. And finally, they have decided to join NATO. It's so amazing to me how they could convince the people in the country to go after such a drastic decision, such a extreme decision of joining NATO after all those years of being neutral, being like what Austria is today.
right. No, they didn't convince the people. They just forced it on them. And of course, with a little help from the monopoly situation as far as media is concerned, yeah, both Finland and Sweden have a very strong hold on all the media outlets. It's basically like this, you know, the Associated Press, right? And they get all their news information from them, which is you know, propaganda, and they just publish that, and real journalism has gone. It's gone, because what happens is the companies that run the private sector of the media in both Finland and Sweden, they're just saying that, oh, you can't write that, you get fired because it's not compliant with the agenda. So there's been no real information about anything, and most, I mean, in Finland it's more surprising that they joined NATO. Sweden has had so little. It's so long ago. We're in some kind of a military conflict. I mean, it's 200 years since last time. So, you know, even the grandparents don't know anything about it. You know, no knowledge has been passed down by the generations. But in Finland, it was prevalent until about 1947, 48, 49. But at Finland, Norway, and Denmark joined NATO immediately after World War II, and I can understand why, because they had been occupied by Hitler. So that's understandable. But we were never occupied. Finland fought a war, a short one, with both the Soviets and the Germans, but never occupied. So, yeah. But it's strange how this could come about. I mean, but you know, I told a lot of people, like, why would we join NATO? And another thing, Article 5, as you know, one country gets attacked, the other ones are supposed to one for all type of thing. But NATO doesn't have an army. NATO doesn't have an air force. They have a bunch of bureaucratic admirals and generals and an administrative office in Brussels and in Netherlands. NATO is nothing. It depends on the member states' capacities and willing to go and send our troops to another country to fight for NATO. So, but these are the things that journalism don't write about it. They don't even tell it. That's why I like your channel, Judge channel, Napolitano's channel, Redacted, as you see. That's where I pick up some of my information, but I also have access to some of the Russian information and so forth. So the thing about both sides getting to voice their opinion does not exist in Scandinavia, unfortunately. But it's not much better in the US if you follow CNN or MSNBC and all those, you know. It's not
Not
much.
much better, no.
No.
And
But Dialogue Works is where you can get some good information.
thank you. That's you're so kind to us.
No, that's not nothing. I mean, you got so many subscribers as well, and there are a couple of independent medias in Sweden, and I have contact with both of them. As a matter of fact, I did an interview with one of them called Frihetsnytt. It means Freedom News, and they're a small operation with not much resources and all that, but they actually are on it all the time with correct information, where they get not from the big news agencies, but from various smaller, free journalists. There is a few even here. And of course, you have to be able to understand and speak English, because if you only speak Swedish, you're very handicapped, because then you're so limited to what information you can actually understand. And I speak a few more languages. I speak Swedish, Norwegian, and Danish, because they're more like dialectal differences. I speak German, of course, Spanish, and not Portuguese. Unfortunately,
you're amazing.
Some of it.
Yeah, it's so amazing to hear that. And
Do you
I
speak
think
Portuguese?
I do speak Portuguese, Persian, Spanish, English,
Yeah.
and
Yeah, so you
a
have an
little bit
advantage.
Turkish.
Oh, Turkish. That's interesting.
Yeah, and when it comes, Hakan, when it comes to the policy of Europe and European countries, we know that the war in Ukraine was devastating for the economy of Europe
Yeah.
altogether. We cannot single out one of them that was not influenced, was not affected by the war in Ukraine. And the war with Russia, and right now with Donald Trump in office in Washington, there may be some sort of conflicts between the United States and China. Here
Mhm.
comes the question in the mind of Europeans: what do they want to be in the future? Are they going to be do they really want to be a powerhouse, to be independent, to make their decisions based on their benefit and what would benefit them in near future, in a long run, which is so much important for all of the countries in Europe that are hugely dealing with economic problems right now.
Mhm.
Here, how do you see the the way that the people, at least in Sweden, see the European Union?
Well, the European Union, first of all, it's a hopeless situation for them. I mean, it was a good idea from the start to. I mean, mainly it started with the trade union between France and Germany in the 60s, as far as steel and coal. It was called the Steel and Coal Union. That's a good idea. Trade agreements. But then all of a sudden it has evolved to a bureaucratic, enormous apparatus with over 20 countries with totally different languages, totally different culture, totally different political interests. So you can't really know. I mean, we have examples of Hungary, Slovakia, Serbia, and other member states that hasn't benefited from the membership at all. Sweden has not benefited in one single issue by being. We joined in '95, the European Union, and since then we haven't had anything come out of that actually was good for the Swedish economy or Swedish people. Our representation in the European Parliament is like 19 out of 700 seats, I think it's 19 or even less. And the other thing, EU is only 6% of the global population. And being the big engine, the industrial engine, Germany is collapsing. Their car industry, they have no energy. I mean, they closed their nuclear power plants, all of them. Sweden only closed 6 out of 12. So we are still in good shape. So with the energy problem. And the problem is that EU has a very, very hard time to unify in issues. If you just look at it as the European Union as a trading bloc, I think the idea and the will is that we're going to keep good relations trading wise with China, as well as the United States and all the other trading partners. But they have a hard time achieving it because there's no unity. It's all different. And the other thing, it's unfortunately enough, the EU ruled by 60,000 bureaucrats. And bureaucracy historically kills economics. It kills trade. And then there's another problem. There's corruption in the European Parliament. There's thousands of lobby organizations that actually tell these people what to say and what to do. I mean, they're in Davos, all of them right now, listening to the World Economic Forum, together with BlackRock, all the bankers. The largest companies in Sweden have 5 representatives in Switzerland right now, each. Ericsson, Volvo Cars, the larger companies like SKF, Atlas Copco, Skanska, the biggest actors. And they're not listening to the parliament. They're not listening to the Swedish parliament. They're listening to the bankers. You know, it's a disaster. The European Union is a disaster. It needs to be dissolved to make it function. We can, I mean, just get rid of the European Commission and the European Council. Keep a small parliament with a couple of representatives from each country, proportional to their population or what have you. And then they don't allow nationalism. You see that with Viktor Orban. I mean, he got penalized because he didn't want to agree on the migration thing. And the other, maybe the most important problem with the European Union is something they call the Digital Services Act, which is allowing any government members or member state to censor anything. Whilst Donald Trump just told him, I mean, one of the executive orders said, no censorship whatsoever. Let it go. In Europe, they're going the other way. They're creating all these rules for censorship. And like I said, and giving more and more power to the bureaucrats. The parliament is just a sad circus of bought people that stand up and argue a little bit. The decisions are made by the European Council and the unelected Ursula von der Leyen and her associates. That's where the decisions are made, behind closed doors. So it's a democratic problem, and that will spill over to the ability of the European Union as a body to make sensible decisions. So I don't see a future. I'm hoping personally to see the whole European Union as it is right now dissolve.
Do you see Donald Trump as an opportunity for the people who are tired of the European Union, or he's a threat?
He can put pressure on the European Union, I think, and I would hope he does it in a good way. I mean, the one thing that they're talking about right now from the European side is his will to stop taxing the American people and start the income coming instead of from tariffs. And they're going, oh, but I think that's good. And the European Union is doing the same thing. I mean, look at Volkswagen closing some of their factories. All the European car manufacturers are in deep trouble. Most of all, from thinking that electrified, the new Green Deal, you know, everybody, they had actually decided that no combustion car engines after 2030. And they're trying to make electric cars, and battery factories in Sweden that gone 60 billion, and they can't produce one single battery because they don't have the technology, the knowledge, and they don't have the workforce that can do it. So they had to import Chinese personnel, Chinese machines, whatever, to Sweden, and it still didn't work. So what they did is they put tariffs on imported Chinese electrical vehicles up to 30%. And then they're afraid that Donald Trump is going to put 5% on imported goods to the United States. I mean, come on. Look at what you're doing yourself. China doesn't see Europe either, though they haven't reacted, because even though they're tariffed, they're still cheaper and still better than whatever BMW, Mercedes, and Volkswagen can produce. So the Chinese said, all right, but we're still selling. No problem.
Yeah. The conflict in Ukraine, which is so important right now. And we know that the Trump administration, and as he mentioned before 2024 presidential election and right after the election, yesterday, he was talking about how he wants to put an end to the conflict in Ukraine.
Mm-hmm.
Is that going to be difficult for the European countries to go with what Donald Trump is talking about Ukraine, or they're going to get aligned with the policies coming from the United States?
Yeah. Now, what they have said is this. Let's say Donald Trump, first of all, said yesterday that he wants the European NATO nations come up to 5% spending on their defense budgets, 5% of the GNP. Okay, Sweden is about 2.7. There is none of the European NATO member states that are 5%. So he's basically talking about Europe's got to take its responsibility. But in the same time, Trump says, I'm spending a lot of money, but I don't want to spend any more on Ukraine. He actually said that. So in my opinion, if the United States shuts off the money and the supply of weapons to Zelensky, basically, and all the other corrupt people in Ukraine, and that would end the war, not immediately, but pretty soon. The problem there is the European Union has said that if that happens, we will have to step in because Russia can't win. They say Russia must not win. Okay. And then you wonder, if you're a sane person, why is that? Come on. I mean, you've heard some of the idiots in the U.S. administration under Biden say that this is perfect because we're fighting a war with no dead American soldiers. We'll let the Ukrainians die for us. That's great. And Lindsey Graham said, oh, they're sitting on so many trillions of natural resources that we now can get for free. Come on. Where's humanity in some of these people? You wonder. Sweden actually have sent a lot of weapons to Ukraine already, a lot of money, totaling a value of about $6-7 billion. And I mean, Sweden is a country of 11, maybe 10, 11 million people, and we're heavily taxed. And we also have a foreign aid program where we send $5-6 billion to Africa, to what have you. And Sweden is falling apart. We used to be the most prosperous country in the world per capita just 15, 20 years ago. And the factors have destroyed that. Immigration is one. We have that problem here too. It's an overload. And then we have the foreign spending, and now involving ourselves in a conflict we have nothing to do with and nothing to gain. We have nothing to gain from the membership in NATO. In fact, we're going to have to be spending 5% of our GNP. It's crazy. Suicide.
Yeah, because the military-industrial complex in the United States wants to sell more weapons to Sweden and Finland. Because they have new members, they have to integrate into the system of NATO the same sort of weapons, the same sort of strategy, I don't know, the same sort of training on the part of NATO. And here comes the cost for these two countries, which would be great in a long run, in my opinion.
Yeah.
And
you know, look at Germany and France. I mean, same thing.
Yeah.
It's costing so much money, and you know, of course, you know who's got everything to win is the defense industry, mainly in the United States, but even in Sweden, because Ericsson, for example, the company that I mentioned, they're big suppliers of electronics to Raytheon, for example, to General Dynamics. And Sweden, of course, has its own military industry with Saab. And we manufacture our own submarines, our own fighter jets, and things like that. And they're like getting order after order after order. And some of them, the Swedish-based companies, are nowadays owned by BAE, British Aerospace and Engineering. But these people are all in Davos right now. The CEOs of all these companies in the war industry, in the weapons industry. And the vice president of BlackRock was asked by Rebel News yesterday, what are you going to do now if there are no more wars in 4 years? How are you going to make your money? He didn't answer one single question about that. Just walked straight past the journalists. So he goes into a closed room and he says, look, there's somebody here that maybe wants peace. How can we stop that? Well, we'll start up another war somewhere. I have an idea, said some other. We can attack Iran, for example. Yeah, that would make us a lot of money. It's cynical how the world works.
You talk about immigration. I think it's a huge concern in Europe and even in the United States. Donald Trump was talking about it.
Yep.
But the main reason of this sort of immigration is what is happening in the countries like Ukraine, in Syria, in the Middle East. These are all endless wars that made these people leaving their countries and going to Europe, going to many countries. And it's so amazing to see how the Europeans can convince themselves of their policies they had toward these countries. The most recent country is the case of Ukraine, and many people came from Ukraine to Europe.
Yes.
And on the other hand, they're making some sort of delusional enemy, and just they're making a Russia as an enemy, as the ultimate enemy for the West, for the Europeans, which isn't the case. Everybody knows that doesn't make sense. And after that, going to war with Ukraine, destroying a country, bringing all those people into the European Union, it's a circle, Håkan. It's a circle. And it doesn't seem that these people who are decision makers in the European Union totally understand it, or maybe they know what's going on, but it doesn't benefit them to think that way. to
Yeah.
decide based on the reality.
Hmm. Well, they made the European Union states agree to a lot of immigration pacts, as they call it. Global Impact for Migration signed in Marrakesh in 2012. There's one recently last year that basically forces quotas to receive migrants. And like you said, this is created. Sweden took a lot of when the war was going on in Afghanistan and Iraq and those places, which is all fueled by the United States. We had a stream of refugees coming, fleeing from bombs, and I understand them. And they wanted to seek refuge in Europe, and it was all. But then, what that does is there's these people that they're economic refugees that were classified as the same. And the trick was you get yourself into the first EU country from wherever you came, Somalia or, someplace that there is not a real war, or any other country. And you just throw your passport and you get free passage to the country of your decision. And a lot of people want to go to Sweden because they know that the social benefits here are very strong. So they can come here, get a good life. They have no reason to flee other than they want more money. And that's how it works. Germany is now trying to forbid the party Alternative for Deutschland, for Germany, because they're strong in the opinion and they have a new election in February. And they want to stop the migration completely. They want to shut the borders of Germany because they realize they have to do that. But now there's a case in the parliament that's going to the High Court of Germany to forbid the party. So democracy is out the window in a lot of places in Europe, unfortunately, in Sweden as well. Maybe in Sweden, we had an election in 2022, as it's called, the Conservative Bloc won. But they consist of 4 parties, I guess. They haven't done anything to change the socialism that was before. Nothing. They've done nothing about migration, nothing about lower taxes. Instead, they've integrated us in NATO and done another bunch of stupid things. So,
yeah. Just to wrap up this session, Håkan, if we assume that Donald Trump would force Europe to fight with China, what would be the final decision on the part of Europeans? Because we know that Europe is not prepared for any sort of fight with China, and I don't know if
military or economically.
Economically, I'm not talking about, because Donald Trump, as far as I know, he's not interested in any sort of war, and I don't believe that he wants any sort of war.
Yeah,
but he wants to confront China economically, because that's why he's talking about Greenland, he's talking about Panama Canal, Canada, all of these things, because he sees the big picture. He wants to make America, as he mentioned, he wants to make America stronger than before, which that's why he's talking about all of these points. But after all, Europe would be so much important and crucial in his decision toward China. I want to know, how do you see Europe dealing with China and considering the policies coming from the United States?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think it's going to be a decision by the Europeans if they choose protectionism or not. I mean, because a lot of the industries that are developing now, which has to do with the Green Deal and all that, is completely dependent on imports from China when it comes to rare earth metals and lithium and those things. And also manufacture products like electric vehicles. And so are they willing to sacrifice something just to comply with what Donald Trump can do? Donald Trump sits in a totally different position than the Europeans do. They're not as dependent on China as Europe, I would say, not being an economic expert or anything like that. So it depends on what they decide, which way they want to go. Unfortunately, they probably go the worst place or the worst way they can possibly imagine, because we're run by bureaucrats and they're stupid. We're not run by intelligent people. Intelligent people, they're in other places. They're not in power in Europe, not in the parliament, not in any other nation, I would like to say. Look at Macron, look at Keir Starmer in Britain. These are clowns. Olaf Scholz in Germany is a total clown. Poland has this Donald Tusk guy who's insane, basically. So whatever way they choose, it's just going to be the stupid one, whichever comes first. I don't know.
Do you think
it's a very hard question to answer, Nima, because there are so many factors involved. What could happen if the Europeans start taxing Chinese products? Nobody knows the consequences, because European manufacturing, which is still alive somehow, is so much more expensive than just buying it from India or China or from any other BRICS nation. So are the consumers willing to pay double at the grocery store? Question mark. What kind of gas prices can the consumers withstand for getting around in their cars or in the airplanes or whatever? There's a balance to be found somewhere, I guess.
Do you think that the rise of AfD or AfD alternative for Germany would be a threat to NATO? And do they really want to get out of NATO? Because some people
They haven't said that. What's her name? The leader there. They've indicated that they want to leave the EU. So far, nothing what I've heard from AfD says anything about NATO. But I could imagine they are nationalists, conservative nationalists. That would make it sort of against their ideology to be in NATO, to be in the European Union. So they haven't actually spoken, as far as I know, other than they've indicated that the EU is not good for Germany. So we'll see.
Do you think that the European Union can survive if Germany leaves the European Union?
Nope. I don't think. If Germany leaves, then there's going to be Hungary, there's going to be Slovakia, Czechia. It's going to collapse. Not immediately, but it couldn't survive for many years if that happens.
Because in my eyes, Germany is the foundation of the European Union. A structure without foundation doesn't make sense.
Yeah, it's been for a long time the economic motor as well. They're paying the most money to the European Union, but now they're not that industrial force anymore because of their stupid decisions on mostly with the energy thing. And now Zelensky shut off the pipeline that goes through Ukraine, I guess he is counting on the $700 million a year that he loses by doing that. He's going to be able to fly to some other country and get those money somehow anyway. And there's military information. They tried to blow up the last pipeline that goes from Russia through this Black Sea to Turkey, where Turkey can distribute it further into Europe. So now the only real pipeline that's left is the one from the Norwegian gas fields to Germany. But it's not, doesn't have the capacity. Plus, the Norwegian gas is about 3 times the price of the Russian. So now if Germany leaves, the EU is finished.
Maybe that's why they're so afraid of AfD, alternative
They
for
are
Germany.
very much afraid of them, yes.
Yeah. And before wrapping up, in your opinion, are we going to see European countries, maybe Serbia, joining BRICS?
I hope so. It wouldn't be, it would be a smart move.
Yeah.
It's a small country, of course, but, you know, yeah. And if one European country decides to join BRICS, you could have a little bit of a domino effect, hopefully.
It's a, as you mentioned, it's a small move, but it's a very important and huge move on the other hand, because it would have a huge influence on the other countries that.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. It's politically a bomb.
Yeah. It's a political bomb. Yeah. Exactly. Thank you so much, Håkan, for being with us today. Great pleasure to talk with you.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me, Nima. It's been a pleasure.
Have a great time there. Bye-bye.
You too. Bye-bye.